Thanks for joining us for the latest episode of the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoTSSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm Brian Sherman, Content Director for IoTSSA, and your host for today's discussion. And joining me for today's episode is John Ford, Chief Information Security Officer for ConnectWise. John served for 6 years as founder and CEO of Ciena Group, a leading data-centric managed security services provider that was acquired by ConnectWise in 2018. He brings more than 22 years of security and technology experience, holding CISO and CCO roles at several large healthcare, technology, and government organizations, including MCS and WellCare health plans. Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, John.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Great. Looking forward to today's discussion. So I always like to ask our first-time guests to share something about themselves, usually career-wise. I try not to embarrass you, but let's start with an easy one. How did you get your start in the IT industry?
Wow, that was a long time ago. I was lucky enough to get hired about 22 years ago by Bell Labs and Lucent Technologies, originally in a network management role, and was doing that and enjoying it. And a short time later, was introduced to network security because actually nobody in my group wanted to take it on. So, it's been a fun ride for me ever since, and, have enjoyed the journey.
Fantastic. So let's turn to today's topic and discuss risk and vulnerabilities. That was one of the things we wanted to get into. What current threats in the cybersecurity landscape have the greatest impact on the IT community? What are you seeing right now?
Well, there's a few things, and the landscape is always ever moving, right? But the most prominent one is that the targets have spread much deeper. Like companies can't assume that they're too small or don't have anything that an attacker would want. So it's that's probably the most significant change over the last few years. But for the threats themselves, I think everybody globally is seeing that attackers have shifted their focus to using, legitimate like operating system and network protocols to stage attacks rather. So in the security community, we call this living off the land. And if you think about all of the protocols that you would normally use to manage IT environments normally, they're exploiting those services. So it makes it very hard to detect. As an example, Symantec put out a report last year that showed that there was an increase in PowerShell attacks of over 1,000% from the prior year, which is just like one piece of evidence that the attackers have shifted their focus. And instead of trying to craft unique attacks, now they're just using services that people do use on a normal day to administer their IT systems.
Gotcha. Now, I know with IoT and the cloud, so many different applications being used. What's a difficulty for an MSP to try to, keep track of all of the different vulnerabilities that not just one client, but multiple types of clients that they're supporting run into?
Yeah, I mean, today anymore, they've spent such a great amount of time building up their practices, if you will, supporting customer environments, right, and running efficient environments, but have not really had their eye on the ball of what the latest threat landscape is, how it applies to them, and how it applies to their customers. So, the reality is there's a mismatch and there's a learning curve for them. It's something that they haven't really addressed over the years. Security for them has been something that's been bolted on instead of baked in, which is what the enterprise realized, 20 plus years ago.
Yeah, the dynamic is not just changing, but continually shifting and escalating. It seems like with from 10 years ago, like you said, it was bolt-on, is you had to look at a couple different things. Now it's every day is a new threat, new type of threat, and not to mention all the social engineering things you can run into now as well.
Yeah.
So you came to the channel with a strong enterprise background. Based on the experience and knowledge that you bring to the table, what are your observations on the MSP community's approach to security today?
Yeah, well, I think, in in some aspects are doing things very well, right? And it ties back to security. So, they've got a solid handle on things like, asset management and configuration management, because these are things that, they've been doing really well for years. And those are definitely security related. Some of the access control items, they do really well also. But because so much of their business is break fix, they're very transactional in nature, right? So they're not, they have a stronger focus on tools, but not process, right? And what we've seen, and I've had to, even prior to the acquisition, I had the fortunate opportunity to work alongside with ConnectWise with some of their MSPs for the prior year. And in almost every case, what I observed is that the big picture was lacking because they made their money on break fix, right? And they were very good at it, but, perhaps lacked the bigger picture of what the customer's needs were from a security perspective.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of transitions, as I mentioned before, over the years. But and MSPs, I think, are the first ones to beat themselves up when we go to the road shows, the IoTSSA security expos, and get the feedback from panelists and from the audiences. You can see they want to learn more. They realize that they've got a really good foundation, but what can we build? And that's kind of the great part. The education part of security is. MSPs, I think, are just thirsty and hungry for this, but they're trying to figure out what are the best practices that work best for, their local credit union client that they have versus their, general office client they have down the street. All those idiosyncrasies, I think, are not just a challenge for them, but a challenge, I think, for all of us as well as the end clients, figuring out what they need to do.
Oh, yeah.
So what are the most common risks in the SMB today that should be a key focus for MSPs? And I understand that you've got some data and things that you've been looking into. If you can kind of dive into that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so we actually have a fair amount of anonymized data in this area. Actually from the result of our initial trial of our ConnectWise Identify platform, which is really an automated approach to doing an assessment against a NIST cybersecurity framework, a risk assessment. So we have well over 1,000 assessments to date. And again, this data is anonymized, meaning cannot be traced back to the MSP or the customer. And really it's kind of telling because, in some cases we assumed correct. And then, in some other cases, there might have been some surprises, but overwhelmingly, the top risks are that neither the MSP or their customers are doing adequate security and awareness training. They lack sufficient risk management practices, and they do not adequately protect or monitor their environments for threats. So those are the top three. There's more that follow out of that, but these are three key items. And if you really look at the attacks that have been orchestrated and have been successful, they hit these three items pretty quickly. So it's really no surprise to us when you look across the breaches that have occurred and say, yep, it's like human element, lack of understanding of risk management and risk of a company, and the inability to really understand and monitor for threats.
So you mentioned the number one, or I don't know if you listed them by how serious they were, but awareness training. I know that's one of the things that traces back to the end users. Are they doing the right things? What are some of the best practices on the MSP side? Are you seeing many MSPs that are going through and being very, stringent with their employees about going through this type of training?
Yeah, we are. I mean, now we are. We've had at ConnectWise, we established a focus group of MSPs, a year and a half ago, and have been working with them, on, highlighting security issues, that are prevalent both for them and their customers. And, we, through that process and as well as on their own, just revealing the fact that this is a tremendous issue, right? That we are seeing, some of the folks, move in that direction. There's challenges when it comes to the MSP and the customer, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but as far as the conversation that they have and how they move the customer to understanding that, security awareness training is a viable component.
Right. We run into the issue a lot of times, I think, with the provider community is it's like, a contractor or anybody, their own house is the last one to be worked on. So from security, I think they're seeing that can't be the case. So I think they're testing to follow through.
And last fall, at IT Nation, it's one of the reasons why we launched this Protect Your House campaign. It was really specifically targeted for the MSPs to say, let's get your own house in order so that you can help others, right? So we launched that campaign back in November and have actually continued it through with success.
Awesome. Now, you had mentioned the ConnectWise Identify. Can you give us a little more detail on that? Is that your assessment platform?
Yeah, correct. So essentially what we've done is we've taken all of the 5 major areas of NIST cybersecurity framework. So identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, as well as all of the subcategories. And we've assigned asset categories and risk profiles, and essentially, taken what I've been doing for 20 plus years, sitting down with customers and performing an on-site risk assessment, and really leading down the same path with, a process that, while it might look like a survey base, it's really not, because it has branching logic in it where, depending upon your answer, we go down a different avenue to, uncover other areas of risk. And so it's pretty comprehensive. It was built specifically for MSPs and their customers. Takes about an hour to perform and provides an immediate professional report. So, we knew we had to build something that would be scalable and affordable out to our customer base as well as to the MSP's customers. So I'm feeling pretty good about the progress so far, and again, the data that we're getting back is really compelling.
Great. That sounds fantastic. Yeah, it's a tool, definitely a benefit to the channel. So we were talking before about MSPs often, they get caught up locking down their clients' networks, that they overlook some of the threats to their own businesses. And this is a common occurrence. Like I said, we're running into that. I would say it's one of the biggest questions we have is, what can we be doing to ensure, since we have the keys to the kingdom, that we're making sure that we're safe first before our clients. Can you shed some light on the impact of, and I'm sure you've seen this, a breach on an MSP's network? How damaging can that be for a provider?
Not to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but it really is their business. I mean, it means their business, right? So, and you said it right about the keys to the kingdom. I mean, ever since I've been in this business, what I've noticed about, attackers is that they're smart, but they're also very lazy, and they take the path of least resistance, right? So MSPs are under attack. They are the path of least resistance, and they have, full unfettered access into customers' environments. At a local level here in Tampa, Florida, I dealt with a customer last year that fired their MSP simply because of a perceived attack. So, it's like, this is their very business. They can't sustain. Most MSPs are SMB, categorized companies themselves. And, if you think about, you have 40, 50, 60 customers, you're targeted, you're attacked, and then your customers are attacked. There's really no way to come back from that, reputationally, or otherwise, right? And things like written contracts or cyber risk insurance is not going to pull you out of that hole. They may help, but this really means the very existence of some of these businesses.
Yeah, the damage of the reputation. I know that I talked to someone who went through this and was able to right the ship, but it took them a long time, and they really had to expand geographically to overcome some of the issues before they could bring some of their original clients even back in. But it was a long process and an expensive one that basically almost
very.
And I think the thing with security is that you only have to slip once to let the bad guys in.
Yeah, I mean it's true, and that's the saying that we use. But, importantly is also there is no perfect security, right?
Right.
And everybody knows that. But what's important along this journey is that they're doing what they should do as a company for their customers, right? So it's one thing to have, a security breach for a 0-day attack, something that nobody had any clue about. People expect that, right? And what I mean expected, if it happens, if everything else is in place and in order and they've been doing adequate risk assessments and protecting their environment, monitoring the way they should, then it's unfortunate, right? But what I'm seeing is that these MSPs are not doing that, and therefore, they're themselves vulnerable. But what they don't get is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and really, their business is at risk.
Certainly, and I think the business continuity side of it too often gets overlooked. Is do we have all that locked down?
Sure.
It's really their insurance policy on the IT services side is how quickly can I get them restored if something does happen? Because inevitably something will happen in these days.
Yeah.
So what are some of the biggest reasons why MSPs struggle? We'll switch gears here a little bit to struggle on selling additional benefits of security or advanced security or, moving beyond, as you pointed beyond is that bolt-on type of product into proactive management.
Yeah, I think there's several reasons, and we've spent a lot of time at ConnectWise with the MSPs over the past year and a half. One is they honestly don't know how to have an adequate security conversation with their customer. And in some cases, it's almost justified, right? Because their customers forever have believed that, the MSP is doing everything for them in security. And why not, right? I mean, they actually get new customers by saying, hey, Mr. Customer, we're going to do everything for you. We're going to take care of everything. You just run your business, right? So they don't know how to have a conversation with them. More importantly, they're not equipped to have a proactive conversation with the customer, meaning to date, it's been a very reactive one. The customer has a malware attack and they call, the MSP and the MSP responds reactively. And unfortunately ends up saying to the customer, I need $400 a month more from you to implement this solution. That's not a good way to have a security conversation with a customer. You never want to do that during an incident, right? The way you want to do it is, and what we're trying to work with the MSPs on, is to have a risk-based discussion. So it's a proactive approach by doing a risk assessment against the cybersecurity framework, in which case we can lay out the top areas of risk and give the customer an opportunity to secure funding and more of a project-based approach to say, hey, these are the top areas of risk. Let's satisfy some of these and we'll monitor the others. But it's a much more proactive approach.
You find the hardest part is letting them know that there has been a change, like clients is what worked 5 years ago. And that's where I see a lot of MSPs struggling is, to your point earlier, is they thought the MSP had them covered. Then they come to them and go, yeah, now you need to do this. But is it important for them to let them know what has changed over the last several years?
Sure. I mean, transparency is always the best. And the reality is, the threat landscape has changed, right? So they don't, it's like some of them may not understand that this is not a difficult conversation to have. It's really just being transparent and saying to the customer, look, this whole threat landscape 5 years ago was not impacting, neither myself nor you, but now it is. And, that's why it's so important to do this from a risk-based approach to say, these are the risks that are out there. These are the threats that are out there, and they're impacting both of us, right? So it's actually, if done well, and we've seen many do it well, it's almost liberating to sit down with the customer and say, we need to start over here because, this is now beyond antivirus and client firewalls.
Yeah, that's a very good approach. I think
there's a second. I'm sorry.
No.
I was going to say, I think the second is that really a lot of the MSPs do not know enough about their customers' business. They know enough about their IT environment, but they don't know enough about their business. They don't, a lot of them don't pay attention to whether or not they're in a regulated environment or they have contractual constraints. Like we see a lot of MSPs that have SMB, customers, but those customers are doing contract work for the federal government, right? And, so they don't have a good grasp on what really is the business driver for those customers. And, and that's a big one also, because to really adequately help them along their security journey, they have to have that frame of reference.
That's a great point, because I know a fair amount of MSPs that work with like local municipalities. And
right.
10 years ago, it was, are the computers up and are the copy machines running? Today, it's, you've got to follow all the records management as well as, making sure that they have open records. And there's just a whole host of things, including NERC and FERC and looking at police departments and the electric departments.
Sure.
It's taken on a life of its own, but
and so they have requirements that they have to adhere to, and the MSP, is blind to that, and that, in aspects of helping them sell security, knowing more about their customers' business would take them a long way, right. In a very proactive manner.
It seems like a good basis for forming some partnerships too, when you're going down roads that you're not comfortable with or have the manpower to handle. What does a risk assessment mean to you? And I know seems like a very straightforward topic, but when we've gotten in many conversations, is I think the idea in the channel of what a risk assessment is varies widely, and kind of looking for some framework behind that.
Yeah, it's probably one of the biggest misconceptions I think that we see in the MSP SMB community, not so much in the enterprise community, because they've been at the game a lot longer. So this is a great question, and I spend a lot of time talking to people about this because you have vulnerability assessments, you have pen testing and whatnot, but in essence, a risk assessment really is just a holistic look into the important assets that a company has and what the risks are against, those assets, right? And normally you guide that or you scope that against a framework like the NIST cybersecurity framework or, the ISO 27001. And this has been the approach that not my approach, but the approach that the industry has adopted for, well over 20 years. Where you begin with a risk assessment, and then, the outcome of that drives what you do next, such as a vulnerability assessment or a pen test. What we're seeing so much in this market is that, and partly due to the fact that, MSPs going back to my prior statement that they're very tools-based, not process-based, right? But what we see is that people are jumping ahead into a vulnerability assessment and not at all understanding the risk. And a vulnerability assessment is different. It interrogates IT devices against a library of known vulnerabilities, right? So, you could do that. It's a very valuable tool to have, but it's meant to support the risk assessment, not in place of it. And what we see when, particularly in the MSP community, when people jump that step and go right to a vulnerability assessment, they're no better off. They're no better off in month 2 than they were in month 1, because we're missing a big piece. So let me give you an example. A risk assessment will ask the question: do you do security awareness training? Do you have information security policies in place? Right? Do you do backup and recovery? A vulnerability scan doesn't do that. It just looks at a machine and says you're missing 10 patches, or, there's a common vulnerability out there that this machine is, likely to have, right? So it's, a risk assessment is something that you can use to plan and forecast for. A vulnerability assessment is a point in time. I could run it every single day and get different results. So, there's usefulness to it, but probably the biggest challenge I see in the MSP community is that they skip that step and they go right to the tool. If there's one thing I learned in 22 years in this business is that there are no shortcuts in security. So, taking that shortcut is not helping their customers.
So that step would also be the place where you get into some of the business conversations as well as things that may relate to their compliance or their customers that they're working with. And that would allow you as the MSP coming in to go, okay, let me look at this more holistically before we bring the tools in and we start working with everything from vulnerability scans to dark web monitoring, things like that.
And it also helps you scope those activities better, right? Because like vulnerability scanners are very noisy by nature, right? So, if your risk assessment reveals that the company doesn't patch on a regular basis, well, then the common sense thing is to run a scanner to see how many patches are missing, right? But you can use the vulnerability assessment in a scoped down version based upon the risk of a company, but just letting these tools run wild the way a lot of them do, you'll get tons and tons of data back, but only, a percentage of it is really useful.
Can you recommend a resource where MSPs can go and kind of find some of this information that they should use in their risk assessment?
Yeah, I mean, SANS puts out some great information. Misty puts out some great information. CISO Online. There's a ton of references out there for people to go to and to get this information in the process, right? NIST is another one. I mean, if you look at there's a NIST document called NIST Special Publication 800-30. It talks explicitly about how to perform a risk assessment and then what the next steps would be. So, there's a ton of guidance out there on how to do this, in a more methodical way, the way that the security industry has derived it. Not so much my definition of it.
Great. Well, thank you.
And by the way, that's the approach that we're taking at ConnectWise, right? So we're not skipping school here and trying to get into the next grade. We're starting, with ConnectWise Identify, and yes, we will have a scanner that will, support that ConnectWise Identify platform. But we're starting with the foundations because we know how important it really is.
Fantastic. So why is it critical, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but why is it critical for MSPs to have the risk conversation with their customers? How do those discussions differ from the security sales pitch? I know you touched on it a little bit, but how can they best differentiate themselves?
Yeah, I mean, doing it in a risk-based approach, then they come across as a trusted partner, right? They come across as adequately interested in the customer's success into their business, right? They're not just running, into the customer at a QBR with, a box under their arms because they're getting 30 points on it this month. Customers are, they're becoming very attuned to the fact that, they don't want the MSP to play whack-a-mole with them, right? They want the MSP to sit down and really, have a conversation about security and partnering with them. They need the MSP, to be in that position, right? It's the last thing you ever want to do is have a security discussion during a crisis, right? The only way to really do that is to take it from a risk-based approach. Where you have a common language with the customer to sit down and say, look, we've identified these risks against the framework. Let's map out a plan, right? How do we want to tackle these? And maybe some of these risks they don't address, but at least it's widely known by both what they are and how, they're going to address it should those risks be realized.
What other best practices do you suggest for MSPs to kind of get that point across? It doesn't necessarily have to be during the sales conversation, but maybe in their marketing or communications. Are there the things that you find are most valuable to back up that security message and hopefully make the sale easier?
Yeah, and not to beat the drum so much, but the easiest way is to align to a framework like the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? Because this is very much like the Starbucks conversation. When you first went into Starbucks and you tried to order coffee, right? They would echo back to you how they wanted you to order coffee, right? So you had to learn to speak their language. And essentially what the NIST cybersecurity framework does is it aligns a common language between the MSP and the customer so that they're on board with the same nomenclature and understanding of what the risk environment is, right? And that's the biggest step. I mean, once they're there, then the reality is they can have, fruitful discussions about what to do next.
Right. And I've seen quite a few that have done a phenomenal job on the marketing side, even from, I hate to say marketing, but it's more of a communication side with their social media, with their newsletters of, alerting, hey, these are the things to be watching for, keeping it simple, bringing it to their business focus, not on the high-end security things, but hey, these are the risks and the threats that are going on, so that when they go in and they follow up on their sales discussion, hopefully their clients and various people in the organizations are paying attention to these things and spotting some issues. And coming to grips with the fact that, hey, you know what, maybe we really do need to spend a little more this year, hopefully a lot more, but
yeah, and back to the upsell or the security sales conversation again. What we found, and it's been proven over the years in the enterprise, is that when you come at people with a risk-based conversation, then you actually have an opportunity to sell more products and services to those customers than you do if you're just running in at a QBR with a box under your arm, right? Because your customer will trust you more. They know that you have their interest in mind, and we all are speaking from the same common language, right? So they tend to open up the purse strings a little bit more.
The relationship part, I think that's also crucial.
Correct.
Yep, very good. So unfortunately, we go through time so quickly, it seems like, on the podcast. But before we sign off today, do you have any final thoughts or things you'd like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, this is clearly a journey for the SMB and MSP community, right? So it's from my set of eyes, right? It's one that I've seen before in the enterprise many years ago. So it's kind of like a hallway of 1,000 doors, right? But the key difference that I'm seeing that I think is important is that the velocity of which is occurring relative to how much the SMB community is spending on security, right? They really need to make very cogent decisions regarding what to build, buy, or partner with, for the MSPs anyway, and how they address that with their customers, because this threat environment's not going away for them, and it's not going to slow down. So this is their new norm. And sometimes I think people lose sight of that and they think that this is just a trend. But it's certainly not going to go away. And it's one of the reasons why we're trying to develop a comprehensive approach for them, so that they can, deliver proven methodologies and practices and services and products down to them, down to the MSPs and to their customers, to try to get ahead of this, because it's certainly not going away.
Sure. It's not going away. And I guess the bright side of that equation is it not going away. It gives MSPs another opportunity to differentiate themselves too with their clients and build those relationships even tighter. So great. Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic. Well, on behalf of IoTSSA, I'd like to thank John Ford from ConnectWise for joining us today, as well as all of you who took time to listen in on our podcast series. I encourage you to check out all the great channel cybersecurity content on the association website, and hope you all have a fantastic and highly profitable day. Thanks again.